wanted to say thank you all for coming. This is part of our Volusia Reads Together program, and I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Well, applause at the beginning, I think that must be faith. If there's applause during, that might be hope. If I still get applause at the end, that would be charity. So just saying. So my name is Paul Croce. I just retired from teaching 35 years at Stetson, and I'm lighting out for the public classroom territory. I have flyers in the back there about my new task, the public classroom. This is part of it, going to libraries and churches and other outlets into the public, just to listen to people, not to advocate, but to listen to people for where they are. I brought some browsing things back there, and if you're interested in any of them, take one of my flyers and I can get you copies of those things. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about the 1960s, not just in itself, but as a prelude to the polarized present that we have now, with some songs. I start with a question. Who is an American? The answer has changed many times in American history, at least for being fully American. And there's been a kind of unfolding of more rights for more people in more years. In keeping with the Constitution's promise of a more perfect union, as it says in the preamble, these changes have not been complete. And each has raised plenty of objections, including in the 60s and since then. So briefly, with the American Revolution, the colonials shook off imperial rule and empire. With removal from an aristocratic country, the new Americans shunned the perceived needs to pay deference to their betters. That's what aristocrats did and just assumed, right? In the era of the civil rights, that brought more rights to African American citizens to be citizens by birthright, with the boundaries of birthright citizenship still a debating point in our own time. Yet the formal rights did not erase the traditions and the laws about racial deference again of non-whites to whites. The progressive and the New Deal era, so going forward in time with a brief recap of American history until we get to the 1960s. So by the late 19th century, with the progressive and the early 20th century, the New Deal era, there were impulses that brought increased rights for workers and voting rights for women. So I'm starting with a kind of picture of American history with an unfolding of rights to more people, more and more people. So broadly speaking, these eras of American history brought more rights for more people by class, by race, and by gender. Then the rights revolutions of the 1960s added to all these changes with an accent on personal lives. And that's going to be sort of an underlying theme throughout my presentation today, on changes in personal lives. And the rights achieved by puncturing formalities in this era in the ways people lived every day. And so I'd like to take you on a tour today of four major changes during the 1960s with the spread of more rights to more parts of our lives, including our personal lives, with the personal character of those changes setting seeds for continued polarized differences. So one of the case I'm making is that the very personal qualities of the changes touched people a lot, but so deeply that it prompted reactions. And I'm going to do this in a story with 5 songs. Now, forewarning, this is also a story with some swear words, or one swear word in particular, repeated loudly. It does have an image of brutality. So just wanted to let you know. But I say this as a heads up to you first, what people on university campuses call trigger warnings about things to watch for, but also to point out that these very intensities added to the emerging polarization. That was part of it. So it's not just for effect, it's actually part of the point about increasing polarization. The first major changes of the 1960s were in race relations. Philosopher and social commentator Cornel West, you may have heard of him, and he was even in The Matrix, you might know, said that this period brought the decline of the age of Europe, with end of assumed dominance by whites in the United States and for Europeans around the world. After all, this is an era of decolonization. And in a sense, the civil rights movement in the United States was kind of a domestic decolonization, so to speak. This was also an era of increased rights for Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and immigrants from around the world. I focus on African Americans for their pioneering role in the civil rights movement, first in the South and then throughout the country. Black Americans took the first major strides toward freedom, that's the name of one of Martin Luther King's books, and also bore the brunt from resistance based on existing racial assumptions of white superiority backed by law and custom. There were two major steps toward the start of the movement for rights in the Deep South for African Americans. First in law, and then with changes in culture. And to kind of set the tone for that, I'm going to play the first of my songs here from Sam Cooke. So here goes. A change is going to come. Here goes. Can you hear it all right? Good, good, good. We could even go full screen. So I chose that song because it captures the mood of hope, but also of challenge. I mean, listen to the, I went downtown, they say don't hang around. I went to my brother, he knocked me to my knees. So it's capturing, in 1964, it's capturing this transition moment, change is gonna come, but it ain't easy. Change is gonna come, but this is the very year when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And so there's still debates over segregation versus integration. The Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 declared that segregation would be illegal. So it seems like would be a done deal. But majorities in many southern states spent the next decade challenging or avoiding the consequences of that ruling. So while the court brought change from the top down, a brutal murder touched people's hearts and helped spur change from the bottom up. And in the summer of 1955, so think of that, just 1 year later, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, a 14-year-old from Chicago, Emmett Till, visited his family in Mississippi. Little did he know, teenager know, that he was walking right into a setting with whites who were seething in anger against the Supreme Court decision. So when he whistled at a white woman, admittedly not the most courteous thing, but he whistled at a white woman, her husband and a friend went in the dead of night to the house of his great uncle, Moses Wright, where he had been staying, and killed him. Till had violated the custom of blacks paying deference to whites. Since the 1860s, with the end of slavery and of citizenship, the birthright citizenship as mentioned, thousands of African Americans had been lynched, especially for fraternizing with white women or gaining independent power, generally without criminal prosecution. This was part of assumed norms, even for blacks, who generally remained silent for fear of becoming the next victim. The Till murder also was not prosecuted. But the difference this time was that Wright, his great uncle, identified the murderer in the courtroom, much to his own risk. Then he left town. Till's mother, at her son's funeral, left the casket open, and this is the brutal scene I warned you about, for all to see, and the media covered the story widely. African Americans and many non-blacks were ready to say, okay, enough. It's no accident that just 4 months later, the Montgomery bus boycott started in December of that year. That was August when he was killed. In December of that year, where Martin Luther King Jr. first came to prominence. The movement to end segregation was a call for political and personal change, with challenge to the daily separation of the races that all had gotten used to. They just normalized it. The system wasn't fair, but it was often backed up with cruelty. And it had become normalized. It's just the way it was. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, fulfilling the hopes of protesters from the street, there's that top-down and bottom-up mingling here, the law of the land now backed equal rights. Restless personal feelings about big social change would linger, especially with acceptance of civil rights reforms. Yeah! Within a decade, all political sides accepted civil rights reforms, conservatives and liberals alike. But many hoped to prevent future changes, and that's where differences set in. In race relations, the 1960s were the first years of our time, with legal changes and polarized feelings between those who viewed civil rights as a first step toward continuous improvement in race relations, and those who perceived it as a great achievement, done, now complete. And thereby lies the polarizations. And my theme for the whole is that set the seeds of polarization for our time. In race relations, that's a way to define the polarization of our time. Is the civil rights movement something, a start to continuous change, or was it a great achievement that we should just celebrate in itself? This picture, by the way, is a sculpture in Indianapolis, and it commemorates Robert Kennedy's speech that he gave spontaneously on the night of Martin Luther King's death in April of 1968. He spoke spontaneously, and if you go and listen to the speech, you can hear him saying right at the beginning, "Do they know yet?" And his advisors warned him, don't go to the black community. But he did, and he gave a spontaneous speech that is very moving. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to a second major change, changing views of gender relations. Before the 1960s, norms for women also included deference. The results were not as harsh as in race relations, but they included patronizing views of women's abilities. Women went to college in high numbers, becoming the majority even by the 1970s. But even with good grades, they often could not get into graduate or professional schools. Women worked in high numbers in jobs, such as teaching and nursing, sometimes called gender-segregated jobs, and they were widely understood as an extension of their role as caretakers at home. Admissions committees expected that further education for even very capable women would be a waste of time, because according to the widespread assumptions, when they married, they would leave work. As Elizabeth Zott says, the character in the novel, which I recommend to you, Bonnie Garmus's novel in the Volusia Reads series. This is the novel called Lessons in Chemistry. The main character, Elizabeth, says, "Successful women don't marry." So there's the either or. And so that was at the heart of existing gender norms, that work and family life were indeed one or the other. Hence the common portrait of suburban housewives. I just chose one example here. You can stretch your imagination even further to imagine images of women at home. Well, let's go to another. Here's some changes. Changes coming. So that is what Betty Friedan challenged in her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. With her bleak portrait of women impatient with caretaking for others while their own hopes and interests remained muffled. Friedan portrayed hopes for women to follow their own ambitions. This was a radical social challenge that reached into the personal lives of most households. Women ran into a glass ceiling, a phrase that began to emerge in the succeeding years. And I present a case of this kind of glass ceiling for an all-women singing group that performed with big names, including Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead. But they never produced a record because the companies did not believe that an all-woman band would be popular. So put on your music critic hats. What do you think of this group that never cut a record in the 1960s? And here they are. They're called the Ace of Cups. And here's one of their songs. I'm thinking that this song, Feel Good, It asks women to consider their own feelings when making choices and not just be caretaking of others. And that's part of the big change of the 1960s that I'm referring to. So it's a groundswell of shifting assumptions that even gained legal support from that very same Civil Rights Act mentioned from 1964. The depths of assumptions against equal rights for women was so widespread that opponents to the Civil Rights Act decided to add the words prohibition to discrimination based on sex because they thought, well, surely that will sink the bill. But it passed anyway. So with passage, women gained more rights. And although the Equal Rights Amendment never passed and still has not, Title IX, for example, in 1972 brought equal footing for athletics in college for men and women entered professions in large number in the succeeding years and decades, with the taboo about choosing between work and family becoming a challenge rather than a barrier. It became possible to do, but even though the challenges were still tremendous. Recent responses to women's rights shows parallels to memories of the civil rights movement and race, with disagreements over the need to continue reforms or to celebrate the existing achievements of women in public life. Challenges about the relation of family and work have been major flashpoints, especially in class divides, with some households able to afford quality child care, while poorer families have scrambled between their need for work and their love for their children. And for women of all classes, questions remained about household and child care workloads and about limits to women's achievements at the highest reaches of authority. There's that glass ceiling again. The changes of the 1960s opened the possibilities for these questions even to emerge. With the personal balancing of work and family transformed, and especially with the fallouts by class, the changes in gender relations landed to different groups of citizens differently, as hopeful liberation to some, or as troubling disruption to others. The cultural contrast added another plank in the polarizations emerging since the 1960s. In gender relations, the 60s were the first years of our time, with women charting their own paths in life. So now I turn to another major change of the time, changing relations with the natural world. In the 1960s, environmental concerns shifted from the studies of experts and the rhapsodies of writers to become popular causes. Think of how it had been in decades and centuries before. In 1849, Henry David Thoreau immersed himself in nature, famously at Walden, and pressed readers to think about nature's struggles while humans thrived. He reflected, for example, and poignantly, "Who hears the fishes cry?" Less well known, George Perkins Marsh, a pioneer and environmentalist, didn't have that term then, he was called a naturalist at the time, studied the impact of human development as a disturbing agent, as he observed in 1864. With the large and growing scale of human development on the land, the public turned to nature for sites of relief from increasingly crowded and polluted human terrains. That impulse led to parks, with Abraham Lincoln himself in 1864 declaring the Yosemite Valley a nature reserve for California to manage, and with the first national park at Yellowstone in 1872. Theodore Roosevelt made conservation of nature a priority. TR set the tone for the next few decades with conserved lands, but with few restrictions on economic development. These trends, along with the tremendous growth of human population and of economic prosperity, not to mention the enjoyments that people had with sports and in movies, encouraged the assumption that nature was indeed full of wonder, but it's out there. It doesn't touch me personally yet. So, with nature increasingly treated almost like a museum, out there, something you go to the way you'd go to a museum. Most people lived in developed cities and suburbs, even as those communities outside of cities give an early indication of a desire for some what we would later call greener lifestyles. You go to the suburbs to escape the crowded cities. By the 1960s, many of the dirty side effects of boons of development, tremendous development, hit home for many Americans. Scientific talk about depleted ecosystems, which sounded so abstract, became very tangible worries about air and water. Pretty basic stuff. Rhapsodies about nature did not remain the stuff of schoolrooms anymore, when the simple beauties of nature could no longer be taken for granted. You couldn't assume it anymore. Rachel Carson's careful study, there she's pictured there, of the effects of DDT, for example, and other economically beneficial chemicals. I mean, look at them. They really were economically beneficial. They highlighted their destruction of whole populations, especially of birds. In her book, the prospect of disappearing bird song, which she highlighted in the title of her book, Silent Spring. Imagine if spring would be silent. No more song. That was the title of her book in 1962. That grasped the imagination of many about what Carson called the strange blight coming from the very agents of comfort and convenience that were so popular. Evidence followed from thick smog in Los Angeles. You can see buildings just barely visible through the smog. And in Cleveland, water catching fire because it was so polluted. Well, Joni Mitchell sang a song that reflected the personal impact a lot of people felt about the environment. One day she woke up in a hotel and she looked out her window and she saw beautiful mountains, green mountains in the distance. Then her eyes lowered to see that between those jewels of nature and where she was, there was a parking lot as far as the eye could see. She said, "That broke my heart." And that's when she started to write the song with its famous lines. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. What do you think of this song? And I'll turn then to her song, Yellow Taxi. Here goes. Take it away, Joni Mitchell. Listen to some of the words. Like the third stanza, that's I mentioned, is channeling Carson. She said, "Hey, farmer, put away that DDT. I'll be willing to have spots on my apple rather than chemically induced perfectly spotless fruit if it can leave me the birds and the bees. Please." That's right from the song. And then the fourth stanza seems to stray from environmental issues because she's talking about a personal issue. She says her old man is leaving and the door slams. But it's actually kind of clever because it enables her to tie in the big yellow taxi from personal experience. This person in her life is leaving in a taxi, the slamming door, and he's gone. And it's a way to connect that taxi with the parking lot of cars in the parking lot. So it's actually connecting the two, and it enables that tagline, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. The idea of assumptions. Assumptions are powerful, and sometimes you don't notice until things are already pretty far along. So linking the parked taxi to the parking lot, as she delivers a personal message there with kind of a wake-up call about how our lost relations with nature parallel the kind of feelings we have when we lose relations with each other, human to human, human to nature. So she's making a parallel there. So 2 years before she wrote this song in 1970, the Apollo 8 crew on Christmas Eve in 1968 took a picture from Earth, of Earth from space. They call it Earthrise, creating an image that symbolized the call to treasure the planet and mend its wounds. Then in 1970, plans for the first Earth Day spread so quickly with such minimal organization, it really was a grassroots effort that included 20 million people in 12,000 events across the country. And the legislation soon passed to bring cleaner air and water, and the Environmental Protection Agency was formed to monitor toxins and endangered species. These actions addressed major important issues, yes. Their very prominence made them relatively easy because so obvious and noticeable. The bald eagle, was in danger of going extinct. It was so obviously noticeable. Air, water polluted, so obvious, so primal to our lives. Other issues would be more difficult to tackle, raising questions about things like disposable plastics, oh boy, fossil fuels in our everyday life, personal, that's touching people more personally. The very power of environmental messages in songs like Mitchell's to touch people's imaginations also prompted many to reel back from such challenges to their lifestyles in their personal lives. Cleaning up America the Beautiful turned from a public purpose, the way it emerged like with the Earth Day and with song, to become a partisan contest. Tensions between the attractions of a healthy nature and the desires for prosperous markets set in motion during the 60s had pervaded American society and politics ever since. Another plank of polarization. So I turn to my fifth topic on changing views of warfare. In the 1950s, while Americans were busy ignoring or starting to pay attention to racial, gender, and environmental issues, the nation's foreign policy was conducted by establishment figures. They were even called the foreign policy establishment. And they even gained the nickname the wise men. They were virtually all men, and they controlled an awful lot of foreign policy. Their organization of a Cold War against communism was shaped by the recent hot war, Second World War, in at least two important ways. First, they pictured American democracy in stark contrast against fascist regimes, including Nazism, with communism as another form of totalitarianism, total control, totalitarianism, even using the phrase red fascism to describe communism. Totalitarian lust for power led to brutalities like the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, and the Soviet gulags. A second major lesson that these men learned from World War II was that Germany's aggrandizements, expansions in the late 1930s through the Rhineland bordering France, parts of Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, and Austria presented case study for worry about how the next totalitarian rise to power would happen through small steps. Beware the small steps, said this line of thought. And in a small country in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh led his rebels against Japanese occupation in the 1940s and sought American support against French colonial control returning after the Second World War. When the U.S. chose the Cold War thinking rather than decolonization, Ho turned to the Soviets and increasingly aligned with communism. Ho's popularity as a national liberator in Vietnam earned him widespread popularity despite his own increasingly totalitarian methods of rule. Supporting division of Vietnam with communist sympathizers moving north and with Western sympathizers moving south, the U.S. promoted a series of leaders in South Vietnam who failed from corruption and infighting over and over again in the next few years, from 55 to 64. That year, 1964, was kind of a year of decision in Vietnam. Allow the South to fall to communist control or send in U.S. troops. And we all know what happened. The latter was the choice of the foreign policy establishment. The congressional bill allowing the president to conduct war passed with only 2 dissenting votes. We think of the Vietnam War as something controversial. Not in 64. 2 dissenting votes showed major support based on widespread trust in the government and in that foreign policy establishment. As America sent waves of combat troops to Vietnam, reaching up to 500,000 in the next few years, and dropped more bombs in the north of Vietnam and the south and its neighbors than all the bombs in World War II, both theaters of war, Europe and Pacific. People continue to support the Washington leaders with their call for beware the domino effect, with fear that its fall, Vietnam's fall, would add strength to global spreading communism. As the violence grew, initial public attitudes seemed to live up to Mark Twain's old quip, wars are God's way of teaching Americans geography. Where is Vietnam anyway, a lot of people thought. But as Americans learned more and realized from television coverage of firefights with villages destroyed and mounting American deaths, the nation divided. The increasingly personal connections to the war through video images, news coverage, and the drafting of young men set Cold War standards against personal revulsion about the violence. So you can see the seeds of polarization emerging right there. So I chose, in this case, 2 songs that were released within 5 months of each other, so essentially the same time period, but with dramatically different views about the war. And here are the 2 songs. The first is from Country Joe and the Fish, taking place in Woodstock, 1969. And this is where I gave you the forewarning of use of a swear word. I think if you listen to his spelling out of a swear word, it's almost like he's trying to instruct young people in being rebellious. Say it with me, he's literally saying to the audience. So here goes. Let him say it for himself.
Give me an F. Give me a U. Give me a C.
Doesn't it? It's playful. So it's what literary people call irony. When you have a sharp contrast between the mode of presentation, the music, and the words being used. Have your boy come home in a box? That's not carnival. That's not playful. There's nothing playful about the words, but the tone is very playful, so it's a way to penetrate into people's imagination along with the instruction at the beginning with that swear word. But it's not all that's going on in the culture. So a lot of people are objecting to just this kind of thinking, including Merle Haggard, a country music singer. So here's an example of people from another side of the culture. During the 1960s, it was sung. This is a recording 5 months after Woodstock. And you can see, he doesn't mention Woodstock, but it's a reaction. So here goes. Merle Haggard, The Fight Inside of Me. Pretty sharp contrast. Different outfits, different words, different sentiments. I'm thinking about tensions set in motion during the 1960s, and they've shaped American attitudes toward foreign policy and warfare ever since. Divisions then centered on whether to interpret the Vietnam conflict as a local civil war or as an outpost of the global Cold War. And division ever since have led to question the dozens of American military engagements since that 1960s war. That many. While others insist on the U.S. as the indispensable world power. In the last few decades, hesitancy for long-term wars has been set against updated versions of militant defenses of American interests. The history of the American war in Vietnam fuels both sides of an ongoing polarization, even as recent political trends have mixed up some of those dividing lines, now with Republicans still arguing for peace through strength, but with reduced world involvement, and Democrats supporting recent wars against aggression. There are many changes from the 1960s that have not endured. And so I'm going to wrap up now with these ideas here, that there are many changes from the 1960s that did not endure. The U.S. is as market-oriented as ever. That's one of the questions that emerged in the 1960s. Even more so since the fall of communism committed to its market systems. Gender and race relations are not completely harmonious. Environmental problems continue to multiply, and America has waged many wars, large and small, since the 1960s. But the changes of the 1960s raised some big questions, especially in these areas, that Americans have wrestled with ever since. Has the nation fully incorporated non-whites and women into the body politic? What are the side effects of growth and consumption? And just how just is America's global military footprint? The very scale of these big questions is actually a sign of national health, even as the enormity of the issues that are not fully settled has generated tremendous tension and invited a range of responses. The resulting polarization has made that decade the first years of our own time. Now, you may think that I'm presenting as an academic guy, and you may think that I'm being idealistic to turn to history to figure out how to deal with present challenges. So you might think of me as looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, so to speak. Yeah, and you know, ideals are things that we actually want. That's why we call them ideals. And so turning to them is a way to say, hey, these are some ideals that you might like to live up to. So I take up this challenge actually next week at a TEDx talk that Stetson is holding a week from today at 5:30. There is limited seating, so if you are interested in attending that, let me know and I could get you a seat. But to wrap up for today, since we're still fighting over the 60s, figuring out how we got into those years and how we managed, roughly at least, to cope with those challenges then, those tensions then, might help us figure out how to deal with our current polarizations. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah. Well, to that I can add, yes, an awful lot of things are the same, and I'll quote the same Mark Twain saying that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. So there are an awful lot of rhymes with what's happening then, with what's happening now. But with that, I'll add that race relations are by no means perfect, but they're not Emmett Till lynchings, and unprosecuted. They're at least debated, and there are all kinds of questions and concerns about race relations, but there's some changes that have emerged. So anyway, it's not it's like the old saying, half a cup, is that half full or half empty? But so there are changes. And you could do the same on other issues too. That women's roles have changed, and there's still debates and objections over it. I think the central challenge is children. How do you deal with well, that's why I use the phrase. I think a major impact of the 1960s is that it made questions possible that weren't asked before. Yeah. To me, that's the biggest change. Is that that sounds pretty not as decisive as saying complete transformation, but life usually doesn't happen with complete transformations, and you might hear me speaking as an academic again and saying well this, and on the other hand 5 fingers, and hearing different points of view, but to me that's a reflection of how life operates. That change. Statements happen very quickly. Our language happens more quickly than life does. Language happens, and we pass a law and we think it's done. But changing people's hearts and changing patterns and changing habits, that's the longer road to hoe. So, many times it takes generations. Yeah, yeah, and coping with a whole level of different issues. Yeah. So another question, a couple more questions percolating. Yes.
I was going to respond to what you're saying.
Okay.
And you just came out with a good part of it.
Oh. So one of the things you said reminds me of a reason why I like to study political and military history in conjunction with cultural history. Because political and military history helps you understand how it is that powerful people hit people over the head. And cultural history helps you understand what's going on inside people's heads. And they're both important, but the crack may look sudden, but the culture takes a while to sink in. So I appreciate your point. So I think there's another question in the back. Did you have a question percolating?
Yes.
Please. Like that song, Mississippi, goddamn, is that song, right? Well, I can speak more to college history books, which have changed substantially, with more what historians call more social history, or history from the bottom up, so more attention to a range of different groups. There's a range of college history books, and I'm sure there's a range of high school history books, which I haven't studied as much. The last time I did was I worked in the late 1980s for Harcourt Brace for about half a year or so, and I did review the textbook that they were using, and it seemed to be beginning to turn toward what would be called social history. But that itself have become fighting words, because a lot of issues that are coming up from just historians doing research on social history from the bottom up is being contested as a political claim, to be challenging one racial group against another. And so my hope is that just inquiry itself will be the standard, and that study of non-whites will be as important as study of whites, because whites are important to study, but so are other groups. So my hope is that the inquiry could be the watchword. There's a lot to be said on this, and I'm doing my part with the public classroom, and there's a lot more to be done, and I can't do it all myself. And so the more support from fellow historians and the more support from the public, the better. So keep your voices heard too. Yes, please.
I'm constantly fascinated by the ebb and flow of groups, attitudes of groups.
Yeah, the middle is increasingly challenging. Yeah. Well, a couple of quick observations there is that in recent years, actually, the key advisor to George W. Bush, Karl Rove, was adept at what I call his policy of winning elections by 50% plus one. And before that time, so that was in the 90s and into the 2000s, in decades before that, the standard for American politics was, even if you're fairly extreme, left or right wing, you move toward the center when you campaign in order to get the lion's share of votes. Moving toward the center, moving toward the center. But the policy, the strategy, really, of 50% plus one is that you only need half. You need that half to turn out. You need that half to be riled up. You need that half to be angry. And so he inaugurated a policy, again, I think strategy is a better word, a strategy for what I'm labeling as the 50% plus one strategy that is still being used. And it's increasingly difficult to listen across differences. And I realize that politicians these days have turned a lot toward agitation and anger on both sides. And I'm kind of swimming against the tide in trying to encourage people to listen across differences. Even if you disagree, listen to them. Doesn't mean agreement, doesn't mean support. But if you listen, you might open up a possibility for some dialogue. And you know what? Maybe some of those ideas that you think are pretty crummy might actually give you some of your own ideas a boost. I call that extra credit, being the professor. I call that extra, you get extra credit if you not only learn someone different in order to be tolerant or helpful toward them, but a little extra credit and maybe like, hadn't thought of it that way. Maybe we can learn some things here. But that ain't very popular these days, and so I'm swimming against the tide, so I'm trying to do my part to encourage listening across the differences.